Well, after having heard all my friends from all the different regions, I thought what I would like to do is to basically link it back again to the bigger picture, all the struggles of indigenous peoples, and then I'll tell you 2 stories or 3 about successes and how they managed to succeed in protecting their sovereignty as well as their lands, territories, and resources. And finally, just talk to you about a few things that are going to happen very soon that we would like you to also be aware of, because this is something that will help further push the struggles of indigenous peoples. One of the things that people don't often know is that, you know, many of the last remaining resources or ecosystems that are still much more intact compared to the others, many of these ecosystems and lands and territories, whether oceans, seascapes, are found actually in indigenous people's territories. You know, there are maps that have been done which show that the remaining, in fact, the Biodiversity Convention is doing these things called the key biodiversity areas. So they are mapping where the key biodiversity areas are in the whole world. And in the Philippines alone, they map this, and these are all in indigenous territories. There's almost nothing in the territories occupied by the dominant populations. And I think if worldwide, that's the picture. And of course, the reason for this is because, of course, the struggles that we have fought, no? As we can hear from Herman, you know, the struggle they have in West Papua has been going on for many years. In fact, the first time I read about the biggest hole in the earth is in West Papua, the open pit mining of Freeport-McMoran, which is an American company, which is still operating until now. And it has actually paid the state police to be their security, and just recently several people have been killed. Workers who were striking against the company have been killed by this state police who were discovered to be paid to the tune of $19 million by this company. So that is the kind of collusion you see between so-called security forces and, of course, the state forces. So, and then to go to Galina, for instance, in Russia, we just came from the meeting of the UN Permanent Forum, the 12th session, and there was a group of indigenous peoples from Russia. And our friends from RIPON, the Russian Indigenous Peoples of the North organization, came, but they were already displaced. You know, if you remember, those of you who have, maybe you helped in this campaign, because the Russian government illegalized RIPON, accusing it as being a foreign agent because it's receiving foreign funds. And then we had to wage a campaign internationally. So many thousands of people wrote, and the government was forced to back off. So we thought that was a victory. Then all of a sudden, in the elections, the government intervened. When RIPON had a General Assembly, they threatened the people not to vote for the ones who are really leading them. And if they are going to vote, they will illegalize RIPON again. So a lot of people voted for the person, the government person, that the government put into the assembly. So now they did not illegalize, but they took over the whole organization. And that's really a big problem, because for a long time, RIPON has always been the representative organization there in Russia. So those are the kinds of challenges that indigenous peoples face. You are either of course, heavily militarized, like what we see in Guam and in the Pacific, in many countries, in the Philippines. In India, many of the tribal communities now are the most militarized communities. And of course, aside from being militarized, you are also victims of criminalization. You know, many indigenous leaders have been tagged as terrorists. Many of their organizations have been included in terrorist lists. So that is already a target that the government can do anything they can do with them. So the criminalization of indigenous peoples movement is happening all over, from Latin America to Russia to Asia, even to of course, to Africa. So this is the picture that we see as we talk here about free, prior, informed consent. So I think the reason why that's happening is because our resources that are found in our communities are really the last frontiers, and most of the multinational corporations and state corporations would like to get hold of these minerals, metals, oil, gas, logs, biodiversity, etc. Even traditional knowledge, because of our traditional knowledge over our medicinal plants and food plants are also being pirated. No? So this is the reason why there is a lot of militarization, a lot of violation of human rights, because of the resistance offered by our peoples against these neoliberal and neoliberal moves of trying to extract these remaining resources. So now, of course, we succeeded in having free prior informed consent embedded in the UN Declaration. This has been a very long struggle. In the Philippines, we already put free prior informed consent. In 1997, our Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act recognized that we have our free prior informed consent should be obtained before any development is brought to our communities. And then so the declaration, which was adopted 10 years later, has 6 articles on free prior informed consent. No, and this is when we talk about free prior informed consent, we shouldn't delink this from the assertion of indigenous peoples of the right to sovereignty and the right to self-determination, as well as our right to determine our own development perspectives and agenda. So this is what free prior and informed consent is. And unfortunately, as I said, there is a lot of distortion, manipulation, engineering of free prior informed consent in many countries. And this is why we have been pushing a lot of international bodies to also include this in their policies. So recently, there are some good news. Recently, the International Council on Metals, Mining in Metals, which is the association, International Association of Mining Companies, just a month ago, they included free prior informed consent in their guidelines. No? There's also the Global Compact, which is the Association of Corporations in the UN. In their guidelines, they also included free prior informed consent. No? So there are now many UN institutions and intergovernmental bodies which recognize this right, and I think that's something that we can use effectively to further our struggles. So how are indigenous peoples using this, and how have they succeeded in some of their struggles? I'd like to tell you the story of Indonesia. No? Indonesia, we have a partner organization which is AMAN, the Alliance of Indigenous Peoples in the Archipelago, which is composed of around 10 million members and around 1,000 indigenous organizations in the whole country. And just recently, you might have heard the news, just recently in March last year, they filed a judicial review of the Forest Law, 1999 Forestry Act of Indonesia. And they said that because the Forestry Act says that the forests are owned by the state, even the customary forests are owned by the state. So AMAN filed a judicial review. They did a judicial review and submitted this to the Constitutional Court of Indonesia. And in May 16 of this year, the Constitutional Court came up with a decision saying that the state does not own the customary forests of Indonesia. These forests are owned by the indigenous peoples, no? So they removed that word, the state owns it. Now, of course, there is going to be a massive review of what does that mean, because many of the oil palm plantations, the mining operations, several of these are found in these customary forests. So there has to be a lot of work done. And the reason why they got that was because, of course, they have organized themselves very strongly. They really got the minds of the best legal lawyers, and then they reviewed this thing. They use, in fact, they used the, when the Constitutional Court made a decision, they referred to the Johannesburg Declaration of the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which we fought for very strongly, and Aman was there, which says that indigenous peoples have vital roles in sustainable development. And they invoke that as one reason why indigenous peoples' customary ownership of their forests should be respected, because they do contribute to sustainable development. No? So that's just one of the examples. The other one I wanted to cite was this, you've also heard about this Niamgiri Hills, the fight of the Dongria Kond tribals in India, no, in Orissa. If you recall, there was this news about this Niamgiri Hills, which is going to be mined for bauxite in India, and the indigenous peoples mobilized strongly against it because they already had an aluminum smelter in the foothills of their forests, and these are sacred forests. These are sacred mountains and forests for the indigenous peoples. So they managed to get, they of course had rallies all over, they filed cases before the domestic court, but they also rallied their support. So one of the first things that happened was in 2005, the Norwegian pension fund disinvested from Vedanta Resources, which owns this company. So they invested something like $36 million, no? And then some of their friends, the Amnesty International, Action Aid, they also filed a case before the National Focal Point of the OECD. This is the Organization of Economic Cooperation in Development in UK, to also question Vedanta. But more than that, they filed a case before the Supreme Court in India, and until India, the Indian Supreme Court and the Minister of Environment ruled that the Vedanta Resources and Sterlite Corporation cannot mine that forest, that Niamgiri Hills, because this is owned by the Dongria Kond tribals in India. No, so that was a major victory because it took many, many years to fight against it, using all the international instruments that they can have their hands on, mobilizing the communities and of course their partners abroad, and they managed to finally get it. So until now, it's not operating anymore, but they still have the refinery and the smelter plant below, which is polluting, continues to pollute the rivers and the lands there in Orissa, no? But I cited these two examples because, you know, the Dongria Kond are seen by they are classified by India as primitive tribal groups, and they're really very traditional, no? But because of their desire to stop all this destruction, they won in their fight against a big company, which is actually the number 17 company that's publicly owned. You know, it's owned by the Indians, but it's a UK-based company, but it's owned by an Indian. So these are just two very inspiring stories that I think we should learn from, because as long as we persist in strengthening our own local struggles, use the instruments that we have gained internationally, and be in solidarity with various NGOs and even governments, like they really talk to the Norwegian government, and now in fact the Norwegian pension fund, government pension fund, has disinvested from Barrick Gold, from Rio Tinto, no, maybe I think they disinvested also from Freeport McMoran, no. So I think one of the steps that we need to think about is to really reach the investors, the shareholders, because when the money is cut dry, then there's no chance that these companies will continue to operate. Okay, finally, I would just like to say that these kinds of gains, the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is going to be evaluated again, no? And this is going to happen during the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples that's going to happen next year in the United Nations. The UN General Assembly decided in 2010 that there will be a World Conference, and this conference will be held in the General Assembly from September 22 to 23 in New York. in 2014, no? So the task of this conference is to evaluate how governments and how UN agencies are implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, no? So we are going to gather, in fact, on June 8 to 12, indigenous peoples from all over the world are going to gather in Alta, in Norway, sponsored by the Sami Parliament, to prepare, to put together all the results of the regional meetings and put together a declaration that will be presented before the UN General Assembly, no? So hopefully, we will be able to get more traction in terms of how the governments are implementing the UN Declaration, in particular, of course, free, prior, informed consent, and we will be able to really show what are the mistakes, what are the gaps, and how will this be addressed so that we will get more traction in terms of supporting our struggles as indigenous peoples. And I would like to end by saying that, you know, many of these struggles would have not been won if we do not have support also from individuals like you, from academics, no? But if we haven't persisted in organizing our people at the local level, I think the solution is really strengthening helping our indigenous peoples empower themselves and strengthening their capacities to be able to understand what these international instruments are, how they will use their domestic laws, and to understand the kind of solidarity they need to forge between themselves and others. And by then, I think we will be able to get it. The challenge for us is to really create a world that's going to be better for our future generations, as Colleen has said earlier. Our reason for being here is to link with the past, but to also safeguard the rights of the future generations and, of course, the rights of Mother Earth. And indigenous peoples, no doubt, will contribute strongly to this objective, and we hope we will always have you in hand in our journey to achieve our rights and to achieve our own perspectives of development, which is more sustainable, more equitable, and more just. Thank you very much.